A very good afternoon to you. Welcome to yet another episode of your Road to Vote 24. For the next hour or so, we'll bring you debates, panel discussions, news, and interviews as we build up to Election Day on Wednesday, the 29th of May. I'm your host, Vuya Mvogo. Thank you for watching. Our focus today, South Africa's unanswered land question. We explore some of the reasons behind the fact that 30 years into democracy, land reform is still an elusive dream. Let's start with a breakdown of the numbers. What does the National Development Plan say about land reform in this country? Well, in 1994, the Government of National Unity acquired 2.2 million hectares of land for reform or redistribution purposes. Since then, 4.9 million hectares have been redistributed. 3.6 million hectares have been used for restitution, while 1 million hectares of land have changed ownership in private transactions. If we take a look at land ownership broken down by race, the white community holds 27 million hectares, or about 22% of land in South Africa. The black community holds a total of 1.5 million hectares, or just 1% of land in the country. The Indian community holds over 2 million hectares, or 2%, while the colored community holds 5.4 million hectares, or 4% of all land in the Republic. In 2023, the NDP set a target to redistribute 30%, that's about 23.7 million hectares of all freehold agricultural land to black people by 2030. Finally, let's take a look at the cost of land reform over a period of 30 years. Government has spent a total of 69 billion rand on this program in 30 years. That's 25 billion rand for land acquisition, 23 billion rand on financial compensation of land claims, and 21 billion rand on land redistribution. Of course, as is customary, we also want to hear from you on this program. Today, we are asking you, has the government done enough in the last 30 years to address the issue of land redistribution? Your options are yes, the government has done enough, or no, the issue is far from resolved, or it shouldn't be left to the government only. You can, of course, respond to this question by scanning the QR code that's on your screen right now. Your votes will come through in real time, and we'll display them throughout the next hour. So please don't be shy. Let's engage. Scan the code on the screen with your phone and be part of the conversation. When we come back, we're going to discuss this emotive issue with the ANC, the EFF, and the PAC. You don't want to miss that. The issue of land continues to be a hot topic of debate in South Africa. Yet very seldom do we actually even discuss the story behind the story. For instance, what happens when those who were previously denied the right to own land finally have land, especially to farm with? A few weeks ago, Newzroom Afrika's Ziniko Mhlaba spent some time with black farmers in the Free State who shared with him their experiences and challenges of owning agricultural land in democratic South Africa.
Free State farmers are crying for help. They are haunted by the impact of the last summer drought. Things are just not working out for the farming community.
So re safara hulu ka baka la drought, kore la drought ya November ha pula e tsama. And then ka December ra ba le pula nyana e nyane e be lo re a jala hape re jala mofuta o mong wa dijalo. Then ka January pula be lo re jale e nile fela nyane be set e be tsamaya. Jale ha sa le o tloa January February re sna pula jale ka nako e tshwantse jale dijalo di thole matla di etseng ke lo re jale se re bana le mathata.
The drought also had serious financial implications for those in the farming value chain. The impact of this will mostly be felt by those seeking employment. Unemployment rate in the Free State remains just above 36%.
And hopefully dinawa ki e nngwe ya sa sejalo se labor intensive. ha re di ntsha tjena bana re di ntsha manual re di futula manual ka matso a batho re hiri batho ba pakeng tsa 50 ho ya 100 hore ba kgone ho etsa bonyane 20 hectare jwale le monsena re kgone ba hira batho bana hobaneng dinawa di ha rena tjhelete re tlo kgona ho ba patala ka yona.
Mpele says things about to get worse.
Drought ena, it has got a far-reaching impact. Hobane re ilo kena seasoning e tlang se ntse re na le dikoloto re sena capital e ntle ya hore re ka kgona hore re sebetse ka bolokolohi ha e felle fela dijalong ha o sheba makgulo the pastures ha di boleng ba tsona le monsena ha bo botle.
The farmers have also been affected by poor road infrastructure.
It is a big problem. And when I say big problem, it is more or less an understatement at this point in time. We have to maintain the roads nowadays, not for the past year, for the past years. We have to maintain it because we have to transport our products, whether it is sheep or cattle, maize, apples. At this point in time, we, the farmers, get more or less what we got 5 years ago.
Farmers say they might be forced to increase prices to recover losses. This could lead to the general public having to dig deeper in their pockets for essentials. For Newzroom Afrika on Channel 405, I'm Ziniko Mhlaba in Harrismith in the Free State.
Well, joining me now to discuss our topic is the ANC's Obed Bapela. Urediretsi Masebe is from the EFF and Sibusiso Kaba is from the PAC. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Lots of expectation in 1994 that finally change is going to come. 30 years on, what is your assessment?
Well, as you will know, that the fundamental struggle in South Africa was about land. Even when you listen to songs that were sung in the 40s, 50s, 60s, it's all about Izwelethu. It's all about the land question. And the land question remains one of the challenges 30 years into democracy. But we have made some strides and around really the distribution of the land, the restitution for those who had came forward to claim, and there were records that were still there to really give them land. And as we said in the figures, 1,000 CPUs are now owning hectares and hectares of land. But the unfortunate part of it, the support obviously was not as enough from government on seeds, fertilizers, and also on the machinery, fencing, and we just gave people land and say, here's a farm, it's in production, continue. But maintenance of the farm, they have to see for themselves. And whatever money that came was not enough to really to sustain them. But training and also was one element that was a weak point where a lot of those farms collapsed. They are unused and then they're just running, they stay in their fallow. And I think those are the lessons that we are now beginning to say, let's then do something differently. And then the army is going to be brought in to then retrain, not only on patriotism, not for military training, but because they have the skills themselves to really come in and retrain and then attract young people in particularly to come in and produce the farmers of tomorrow. And we also have technology. The fourth industrial revolution is here. We also have to then begin to look at that in the schools, in the universities, what skills have been produced and orientate a lot of young people really to go for those skills.
From your vantage point as the PAC, your assessment of the past 30 years?
The past 30 years has been a big failure for us. The willing seller, willing buyer policy has destroyed any possibility of meaningful redistribution. The misuse of Section 25 of the Constitution has been a problem. We have learned from the minerals nationalization, but we have not gone to the land nationalization in a similar manner where licensing is used on top of what is happening on the land. The issue of giving land has not been fully thought through by taking history only into account and not taking into a future. is visible in what we are achieving now in our sector, because we must appreciate that land is also a national security issue, ability to produce our own food, and ability to live spiritual lives in a manner that land can give us becomes critical. And currently, it has not been like that.
I mean, you've entered the space only 2 elections ago, and you made this one of your key issues. Your own assessment as to how this issue has been managed over the past 30 years.
Thank you. No, so I think as the EFF, we've been quite consistent in our call for land to be a central part of what, denotes equality, dignity, and freedom in this country. And over the past 30 years, we've witnessed a lot of incoherent policies from the ANC and that are lacking not only in terms of ideological soundness, but even practicality and implementation. Because you cannot expect a liberal government that is subject to liberal economic influences to be able to really administer such a thing like redistribution of land, because it's in contradiction with what is their raison d'etre as a government. There's no way that they are going to be able to implement such a socialist policy of land redistribution.
Was there confusion or disagreement within the ANC as to the direction that we should take as a country on this matter?
Well, there was no disagreement, and I think you are correct, Mr. Klaver, that the willing buyer, willing seller, which we introduced for over a period of 15 to 20 years, we thought in that way we would have achieved the targets of 30%. We have not achieved through it. That is why we had to change the policy midway to say, this one is not working, and we brought in a policy that we thought also, but because it's still new, to drive it. But then the debate in Parliament and then debate in society has brought sharp in the whole issue that we need to relook at the entire model of land distribution in South Africa. And then that's where we are. I mean, I know that the EFF had wanted distribution of land without compensation, and then others, but we then said...
According to its leader, you agreed, but then...
We agreed, yeah, but then there was an element of the models that then made us to differ with the EFF, but the issue of the distribution remains anchor, it's important, but the models, we just have to really fine-tune. There were those arguments that Section 25, you don't have to really amend it, we don't have to even bring a legislation, itself is enough to then expropriate land. And then hence, we have just introduced now as we go to elections, it's only coming late because the law in South Africa takes 2 years to put in place that expropriation bill, where it can expropriate any land for developmental purposes, schools, hospitals, or anything, whether it's owned privately or owned by anybody, we have the right at least with that particular one. But the ownership, it's where we still have to really find a better model so that we could then concur as political parties, as a nation, around that particular model of how do we fast track this. But also giving land to people must go with that program of work it. The Freedom Charter says we will distribute the land, but for those who work it. Maybe Vuyo here does not want land, and you give Vuyo land and you start building estates instead of producing. And I think the EFF element of producing is a very important element. Use the land for agriculture growth, for spiritual elements, for any growth that can really begin to give food security in the country.
Is that accurate, though? The issue is with the model.
Yeah, so I think there are only 2 models that the ANC has introduced since 1994, which is the special partnership model and the market-related agrarian reform. Mm-hmm. And again, it goes back to the point that the ANC is in contradiction with the demand for land in South Africa. Because even when you look at the special partnership model that they're talking about, it happened in Limpopo, I think in the Livubu region. It was a huge disaster. There were a lot of third parties that were involved. In fact, the majority of the figures that we're talking about when it comes to the money that has been used for land redistribution is money that was used for consultants and third parties, not necessarily money that are spent on the actual realization of land being transferred back into its rightful owners. So the models are not working because you've got a clearly socialist intention, but a policy-driven ANC that is neoliberal and cannot. It cannot, by its greatest efforts, contradict itself to that point. So that's why they are failing. There's no model that they're going to introduce except the simple model that the EFF is advocating for, which is that the state must become the sole custodian of land. In that way, we are able, as the state, to make sure that we introduce land audits. For example, that Vuyo might not need land, but Vuyo has a situation where he's settling in an urban center and property rates are very expensive. What happens to that? Squatter camps arise, townships are starting to overflow. We experience a land deficit. So the land audit of the EFF says we're not going to deal with the land question holistically like this because it's not a universal thing. It's not just every factor of land is about that. You know, there's land for production, there's land for commercial use, there's land for settlement. The EFF even says in its manifesto that we are going to have what is called a pre-settlement agreement. So if we give land to a certain area, the pre-settlement agreement must be then abided by, that we are not going to build maybe houses, you're not going to build this. Then we are going to have a post-settlement agreement. So we're able to say the land that we're talking about, what use is it? Not this, you know, obtuse approach of the ANC that land is just one big bulk of a policy and we're going to throw ideas and models at it and hope that it fixes itself one day.
I mean, for a party that, you know, made the land key or central to everything you did, were you able to develop a model that you thought would work in South Africa?
Yes, our model talks to the difference in paradigm with that one of the ANC. Firstly, we are moving from a premise that we must go beyond redistribution and we must go beyond nationalization. We must socialize land. What do we mean? We mean the total commodification of land. Land must be something that is not sellable at all, so that it can only be licensed. I think I already indicated that the licensing regime of minerals already takes us to that paradigm. But as the EFF is saying, the ANC is too afraid to drive it to its full conclusion, even if they already have the power. But on land as well, being agriculture, industrial, for us the model is that decommodification is important, proper zoning for special purposes, and limiting the maximum amount of land that can be owned by an individual or a company, including a director of a company, that you cannot own land as an individual, then own it as a director so that you multiply. But you minimize depending on the kind of land and the kind of production orientated that you have put on the table. So that we move from an orientation of African people are only substantive farmers. We move to commercial farming across the board. But as the PAC, we view this issue as not as complex as it should be. There was some time where we thought that the change of the constitution will be a first step. But subsequently, we have viewed that legislation for general application will achieve the same purpose, as much as we would like really to take out the land out of the property clause.
Well, land is what we are talking about today. Remember, you can take part in this conversation by telling us whether the government has done enough in the last 30 years to address the issue of land redistribution. Your options today are yes, the government has done enough, or no, the issue is far from resolved, or it shouldn't be left to the government only. You can respond to this question by scanning the QR code that's on your screen. Your votes will come through in real time and we'll display them throughout the program. This conversation continues right after this. Still with me in studio are the ANC's Obert Bapela, the EFF's Urediredzi Masebe, and Sibusiso Kaba from the PAC as we continue our discussion on South Africa's unanswered land question. We are discussing some of the reasons behind the fact that 30 years into democracy and 69 billion rands later, land reform is still an elusive dream. Where to from here, Mr. Bapela?
Well, I just want to first by engaging the model or the policy of the EFF. When they say land to the state, and then the state is the custodian on behalf of everybody. That in itself will not find its way in South Africa because we've got 4 models of ownership. Private ownership, including yours now, with whatever property that we have here. So it means if you state-owned land, it means then even that private ownership will then go to the state and you only own the property, but no longer the land. So the element of engaging South Africans to agree to that. The second one is communal. Traditional leaders are owning 13% of their land. And they are not owning it, they're in custodian on behalf of the communities. It's not their land. It is the community's land, and that is a collective ownership by those communities. And now if the state takes that land, it means then there's going to be disputes that will arise with the traditional leader to say, why are you taking away something that we are already owning and you want it to go into the custodian of the state? Then it's the state, which about 14% of the land is owned by the state, currently in South Africa. And then we have your cooperatives that are jointly small committees who will own for certain purposes and production. So the custodian of land on the state is Chinese model. And I know that EFF took it from there, literally as is, without applying the African question, which is our own issue here in Africa, that people have always owned land. And then therefore, the distribution and the restitution is a model that then begins to take land back to the people. But slow as it may be, costly as it has been, and the introduction of the compensation element, we then say fair, no longer as extravagant, not in the market elements of it, but distribution ought to happen, need to be accelerated, and then the restitution obviously still has to be lower. And then so that the next 30 years we can then begin to see us reaching 30% of the NDP, not in 30 years' time. This time we need to fast track, but engage further on certain models that might be helpful from the PSC, Lona and EFF and others. But I know that there are these white parties that will definitely not even agree to anything. But we are not far away from each other except the policy model and then the models that I've said.
Is that an accurate representation?
No, it's not. I'd like to dismiss the idea that Mr. Bapila is coming with, that when the state becomes a custodian of the land, then there's some kind of cultural tiff that we're going to experience with traditional leaders. Because historically, African land has always been communal land. Africans are not, essentially obsessed with the idea of private property. What they really are interested in is access to that land, And that is what's going on even right now. Traditional leaders do assign certain portions of land in the rural areas. There's nothing different from that with the EFF. Our people are not going to have a problem when the state is the sole custodian. Our people have a problem when they cannot access that land. No one cares what chief in Mpumalanga controls what part of land. All they care is that when they ask for land, the chief grants them and assigns a portion of that land. So we're not, as a people, obsessed with private ownership and private property. And that's why, even if you can accuse that this model was taken from China, it really, in its root, in its essence, is an African model of thinking about property and ownership.
Is the Ngonyama Trust model the answer?
Not really. I think it brings a question of traditional leadership and a general governance. It seems like we talk like the chiefs are outside the state, whereas as the PAC, we view them as part of the state. Although currently they are a stepchild, the reorientation of the governance will assist. I think the land will drive that process as well. But we share the view that government must be the only licensing authority for use of the land, no private ownership. Everything should be communal. We share that view with the EFF, and we are further saying that zoning becomes critical. The state has not rezoned properly and thought what land should be used for across the country. Even state land is lying underutilized because we have not thought through what we need to do about it. It just belongs to Transnet. It belongs to Eskom. But there is no real drive for productivity and driving the economic growth that the land underpins.
Are you happy with the Ingonyama Trust model?
Well, for so long as people are happy, but I know that there are divisions around it, particularly those who are not in the traditional leadership setup, to say that it denies them the right. I mean, remember there are these cultural phenomena also that we need to clean out of the system. But generally, the people are happy with it, except those who says, I want the security of tenure. And then that security of tenure, even the urbanized, if you can say to them, we're taking all your title deeds, they'll not say yes, they'll never say yes to you. Because security of tenure is fundamental to my right of occupation. And then probably what then we can then begin to look as this land for production, then be engaged differently. But then the right of ownership with the security of tenure, where we have a title deed, should not be something that we take away from the people. And the ANC is not advocating for that. But let me finish then with the permits to occupy, which are the permits that are given by traditional leaders to people in the rural areas. That one, we are now beginning to develop a law that is going to give some kind of security of tenure without them taking away the land to a private family ownership. But the right that no one can expel you, no one can evict you there, so that when the land is now given to the family and assigned for family for settlement or for production, then it should then be in that particular context. Unless you decide to say, now I'm abandoning it, I leave this thing, and we leave everything else is, and then you go elsewhere. And I'm not sure whether there will be any compensation, because the land will remain communal, but with the security of tenure, not the title deed.
You wanted to chip in?
So, again, this is something that's already happened. I think Mr. Mvoko, it was the CIC, the president of the EFF, on your show, who commented on the situation right now in Waterfall, where the people who stay and settled in that land don't own it. They went into 99-year leases, right, with the private company. They don't own that land. So once the period of 99 years is over, the property company is going to come and renegotiate another deal. But at no point are they going to ever be owners of that land. So it's already happening. It's just that maybe when it comes from the EFF, maybe it sounds riotous, but it's already happening. Another thing is that the EFF in its manifesto says, we want to regulate chiefly powers in the rural areas to ensure that women and the youth also have access to land. Because as Mr. Kaba of the PAC is saying, chiefs are part of society. They are part of the community. It's not some despotic rule that happens in the rural areas where there's now this dictator. They are part of society. That's why they were even involved in the land public hearings before the ANC reneged on his position that they took in parliament. The chiefs were part of those public hearings because they understand the centrality of land for their people and also for the security of their communities.
What is the answer, Mr. Kaba, to informal settlements? How do you use land to resolve that particular issue?
Informal settlement are a sporadic response. The first thing is proper zoning, proper putting the land and making sure that services are brought in the area. Then you do the housing later, but you must already have a plan, seeing that the urbanization is moving faster than you can build the houses. But the real solution is to redevelop the rural economy by building proper agriculture and reverse the migration. We're currently looking at urbanization over 60%. In the past 5 years, it was the first time where we crossed the 50% from urban to rural. We're a rural country. Now we're an urban country, and we're a disorganized urban country. So we need to zone properly. We need to create industries at the back, and the critical industry to create in rural town, it's agro and agro-processing. That's an industry that is proven generation to generation that it absorbs quite a lot of employment, and also it creates quite a lot of wealth. more than any other, including the new technologies that are emerging. They still cannot beat that industry.
What is the ANC's thinking right now
Well,
about informal settlements and how we use land to address that issue?
I agree with Mr. Klaver from PAC. Urbanization is very fast. It has overtaken planning and development in many municipalities. People just hawk and then just find any land piece and then settle there without services, without anything. And we have been honing the municipalities, particularly the big cities, that we are the magnets because people leave rural areas for opportunities. And I agree with you that until we then redevelop economy and in the rural areas, we cannot arrest this particular inflow, and it is heavy on the towns and the cities and then the big cities. And therefore the model in China, which we are also looking at very seriously as the African National Congress, and not the one of the land ownership by the state, is the issue of how they've really settled their rural areas with agro-processing, secondary and tertiary agro-process, not just primary. So that then they also then took the cities models or a small city to them where they have market squares, they have shopping centers. They produce the goods for the city people who says, you don't even have land to do anything, so we can produce for you. So that model of the rural areas, I fully agree with you that at least we are one on that one, and I think we need to move faster and fast track it so that the rural communities can also be beneficiaries of the growth.
I mean, the third pillar, of course, of land reform is land tenure reform, which deals with security of tenure. Just your thoughts around how the government has, over the last 30 years, dealt with that part of the issue.
Of the issue of land tenure.
Yeah.
So I think it obviously land tenure inadvertently throws us back to the situation in the urban centers, right, where people do not have land security. And what we often say is that there's a land deficit in the urban centers, because the ANC government is really scared of having a meaningful discussion with your big capital, with your foreign landowners and private companies, because they feel that they might lose some funding from those companies. But the real fact of the matter is that there is no land deficit in urban centers. This is purely an liberal, economically created situation. Because I can give you an example here, just between Alexandra and Sandton, there is something called the Frankenwald Estate that was donated to Wits University in 1978. On that land, it's quite a huge chunk of land. On 30% of that land, Wits Enterprise, together with another private service provider, wanted to build 33,000 housing units. That is on 30% of that land. They wanted to build 33,000 housing units. So the problem is not that there's no land in the urban centers. The problem is that the government is unwilling to say to a big capital that you don't need this land. Wits University has not done anything with that land ever since it has been donated to them. They've done nothing with that land. But potentially on 30% of that land, 33,000 housing units can be built. You go to the Western Cape in Stellenbosch, there's a squatter camp called Azania that is built on one of the biggest wineries and the wine farms there. Because that company has disinvested in South Africa, but they still own that land. The land is completely unused. That squatter camp is raided on a daily basis by police, by Red Ant, by private security companies to say, get off of this land. But that land is no longer, is not in use for anyone. That company has relocated, is no longer based in South Africa. It's a huge chunk of land. And the government there is still afraid to say, but what are you doing with this land? That is why the EFF manifesto makes it very clear that we are going to ask, what is the use of all the land that these people who now currently privately own land, how much of that land do they really need and how much are they actually using? So that we say we can share this land for settlement or for other purposes.
I mean, speaking of rural areas, I'm thinking of those situations where you have people, farm owners, right? And people living in those farms. You have where you have labor tenants and farm workers. How do you deal with that question while, of course, having to also protect the rights of those people who the farm owners?
You need active government. We've got a government that is very passive. They've basically handed their responsibility.
Passive or scared, as he alleges?
Well, he says scared,
I'm nicer.
he says passive.
They are scared into being passive.
They are passive, paralyzed by fear probably. But they are passive to govern. So they've left the job to the expensive courts to defend the rights of the people. The rights are already in legislation. The rights are already in the Constitution, but it needs a government that is willing to assert those rights. The game that is played by so-called white farmers of just evicting people without consequences, in the PAC government, that would not happen. We will put a stop to that and we'll make sure that those rights that are already in legislative are asserted for our people. Secondly, farmers are underutilizing those farms greatly. Basically, there's a crop rotation that we all know from agricultural one. It's maize versus wheat. It's beans then wheat. So the exchange crop for the farmers in this country is wheat. And that's laziness. And those are the people that are held highly that if we remove them from those farms, we'll be hungry. And as the PAC, we totally disagree. We think that if we bring people who are really invested in farming, we'll increase productivity greatly in this country. We'll go back to be a big exporter, and we'll make sure that we stop importing food. It's a disgrace that with so much land, we're importers of food. We're not exporters as we should be.
When do you stop being passive or scared?
We are not scared, we are not passive. Let me just come to this model of the Frankenwald. There, indeed, the houses can be built. And then at the point when the contractors appointed licensing officers, I come from Alexander, so I know the history very well, better than you. So then the community of Kelvin went to court to stop the project, to say it's going to devalue their houses, and therefore it's a matter that is in court. That's why there's no activity there. The agreements were finally entered into with Wits University. They happened to release, they wanted 1 billion rand for the land initially, and we said, no, you can't buy that land. So we then were threatening them with expropriation, and that's why they had to let go at the price offer that we had to give. It's not been scared, but we are legally using the laws that are applicable in the system, and that's not being scared, it's not being passive. But there are areas where we could have done better, faster, and then really firmly. But then people then have the right to go to court in some instances, and they've really been hamstringing on that. So it's an issue of policy review and really bringing in the new legislation. And we're almost there as parties towards that particular direction. But the issue was the compensation element. Is it zero or is it something? Is it fair but not market related? And I think that's where then we didn't want then people then to go and stop this particular process.
Could it be that the reason you are, for the example that you've cited, is perhaps because there's way too much focus on agricultural land, and there's no out-of-the-box thinking around urban areas, for example?
Yeah, so this is exactly what I said in the beginning, that the ANC has taken the idea of land and they've bunched it up into one confusing, complex thing. And they keep throwing different policies and money at it, hoping it will resolve itself. They are not entertaining the nuances that land is not just agricultural land. There's not just land for settlement. There's not just land for production. So, but because the ANC believes that this land question is one big thing, then they are not using the correct policies to address it. The other thing is that Mr. Mapela says clearly that they threatened with expropriation. So that is a policy that works, because once they raised the issue of expropriation, then they were able to reach a settlement. So expropriation really works. Is that company bankrupt? Did they flee the country? Is the country in disarray? Is the economy collapsing? No, because expropriation is a fair and a practical policy. They just said they threatened them with expropriation, and they reached a settlement. So why can't it be a government policy? Why can't it be implemented? When it works in certain instances for them, clearly it can work.
Why do you think, in spite of the fact that you've championed, this issue for as long as the PAC existed, but it hasn't translated into votes?
With the votes, our people misunderstood what they were saying. They thought that we were looking just for land, but they did not understand that we're talking to their dignity. We're talking to their economic future. We're talking to intergenerational wealth. Whoever owns property will continue to dictate. Whoever does not own property will continue to be a slave. So if we want to be a slave collectively, we will give land to private people, to foreigners, then we'll be their slaves. That's why our people have not got that. But I think with the discussion in the country, it's very clear that the PAC has been successful to communicate this matter. They've been growing voices from different sectors. Political parties, NGOs are comprehending now where we were, that land is important. In fact, land dictates nationhood. Land dictates citizenship of a country. If the land is loose, and if someone is in Germany can own land, owns the country, and you as a citizen are nothing. But we are looking forward to where we'll be competing on the model of implementing the land better.
Do you think if land was the only issue people would vote on, you would win an election?
Well, let me put it this way. When we did research for the election 2 times now, and around what are the critical issues that the nation wants. Even though the land is a fundamental issue that we need to resolve as South Africans, and the land question, without any doubt, must be engaged in upon and find a settlement. But people don't put it high up there. They put jobs, they put this, and it became number 7. So solely alone, obviously it will not. But then combined with other needs that have arisen from the voters themselves, we also add them to balance. But the issue of land, I think that will give dignity to Africans. We fully agree. People fought for land, people died for land, people went to jail for land. And I think it's about time now, in this next 30 years of the journey, that we resolve the land question in South Africa. And the ownership must go towards equality.
Do you know your supporters? Do you know how land, or where land ranks among your supporters?
You can go and check any random EFF T-shirt in the street. At the back it is written, our land and jobs now. Because I don't know what matrix that they used in that research. I don't know the population group that they were targeting. I don't know the age group. And for me, it sounds like a fallacious research conclusion that the land is way down there to the common voter. What we understand in the EFF, and what is the reality on the ground, is that the issue of land is very high on the minds of the voters of South Africa. Okay. So I don't think that they must share that research with me.
But 2 elections we won with that land not being higher up. They put it on number 1, but they still could not garner. Yes, they've been growing percentages, 2 or 3, not just with the land question. And I think you do agree. There are quite a number of issues, people that voters are looking at.
Gentlemen, let me thank all of you for coming through. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you still haven't, please remember to scan that QR code at the top right hand of your screen for the poll we are running, which is also live on X at Newzroom 405, and tell us whether the government has done enough in the last 30 years to address the issue of land redistribution. Your options today are yes, the government has done enough, or no, the issue is far from resolved, or it shouldn't be left to the government only. You can respond to this question by scanning that QR code that's on your screen. Your votes will come through in real time, and we'll display them throughout the next hour. So please don't be shy. Let's engage. Scan that code right now with your phone and be part of this conversation. We'll put up the final result of the poll before the end of the show. Stay with us. Welcome back. Today on Road to Vote, we're talking about land. Now, despite the politics, what's the current legal situation on this issue? I'm joined by Bulelwa Mabasa, who's the head of land reform, restitution and tenure practice at Werkman's Attorneys. Good afternoon. Well, thank you so much for your time. You listened to my previous guest. Just your thoughts on some of the things that they were raising.
I think, firstly, it's not, you can't argue the fact that land is a highly political issue, and that land sometimes, or rather the quest for land, is actually a metaphor in a lot of ways for the feelings of belonging, for an identity on nationhood. It is also a metaphor for heritage and about what it is, and also about remembering the sins of the past that really involved bloodshed and dispossession. And so I think it's, coming into electioneering, my concern has always been that the land question is sometimes used as political football, and that in between elections, it takes a back seat until there are murmurings around expropriation without compensation. And so I think, the time is opportune now that the land question starts to dwell in very serious and educational ways in the minds of the public, and also especially the youth. So in your intro, you mentioned, your comment that you made is around what is the legal system around land. And I think the legislative framework on land is so comprehensive, and there's been so much jurisprudence that has progressed over the years. If you look at something like, for example, restitution is a system whereby the families or descendants of those that were dispossessed of land after 19 June 1913 are able to, or were able to, file land claims, for example, up until 1998. What we see from the legal system is that it has various weaknesses. One of which is that access to law, access to lawyers is a very difficult and very practical issue. It's become extremely litigious, and most communities or families aren't able to access the necessary legal advice when those matters ultimately find themselves in the land claims court. We see that the land claims court has been undercapacitated for many years, previously only operating with temporary judges, with no permanent judges. Although there are changes now to try and improve that, we see that as a fundamental issue that has led to many cases that were 1998 cases that still remain unresolved. And so whilst the legal system is there, we find that there are operational issues that dog this issue around land. When it comes to land redistribution, we know that the Constitution says that the state must make access possible, reasonable access to be possible, so that people can gain access to land. Some of your commentators mentioned that and the political parties' differing stances on, land redistribution. Here, what we see, and that is glaring, is that we still don't have a redistribution act or piece of legislation that entitles the nation to know who can access land, where, for what purpose, and in a way that is transparent, in a way that everyone has access to. So that is still a huge gap in our law.
But then, if it may well be as comprehensive, the law may be as comprehensive as you say it is. But if the law doesn't recognize the repeated failures reform and land redistribution, then it's as good as it doesn't exist, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, if you're going to have a constitutional provision that is a direct instruction to the state to make sure that, there is legislation around redistribution, and we still don't have it, that is definitely, an indictment on the legislature. And same way, it's taken us 30, well, actually even more, because we still don't have an expropriation act that is in line with the Constitution. Yes, the expropriation bill was introduced over the last few years, but we still don't have it in its final form. So you're quite right to say that you can have a legislative framework in place, but if that is not linked with resources, skills, political will, and also, and for me, this is really where the tragedy is. If you don't link that up with a system where, be it an agency that looks after ensuring that these claimants in communities, not only are they able to access the land, but if you don't link that up with real business plans to ensure that land is sustainable, we must remember that land is not necessarily wanted for the sake of it. People want land so that it can promote their sustainability, food security, and also to ensure that they're able to become economic active citizens.
Bulelwa, let's leave it there for today. Thank you very much. She's the head of land reform, restitution, and tenure practice at Werksmans Attorneys. Now, on Road to Vote 24, we pride ourselves on engaging with you, the viewer. Earlier this week, we sent our cameras out, hoping to hear from you on this thorny issue of land reform in South Africa. We asked you, do you believe South Africa will ever resolve the question of land redistribution? And this is what you had to say.
I can say we are not ready, especially black people, because in Limpopo we have plenty of plots. And then those plots, we are not practicing any agricultural practice there. And sometimes agricultural department give us funding. But with that funding, it's either we can just run a project, and then after so many, maybe months or few months or few years down the line, then the project collapses because of the misuse of funds.
I think having fairness in this country, in order to have a fair distribution of land, I think it will be. This is what we all need, and so we're looking forward to having that equality in this country.
No, I doubt. I really feel like politically South Africa still has a long way to go. I'm worried about our economy, so I think whoever's responsible or people that still has land, still good for our economy.
Yes, I do think, provided it's done properly, without any corruption, free and fair, it can be a reality under the right government. So people need to think on a bigger scale.
Well, let's now bring you the results of that poll. At the beginning of the show, we asked whether you has the government done enough in the last 30 years to address the issue of land redistribution? And this is how you have voted. 14% of participants said yes, the government has done enough. 81% of you said no, the issue is far from resolved. 5% of you said it shouldn't be left to the government only. As always, thank you very much for your participation and for your views on this matter. Now, just before we go, I'd like to say this. Over the last few days, we saw a real-life tragedy playing itself out in George in the Southern Cape. A building still under construction collapsed, trapping 81 people. The death toll is now up to 19. Sadly, it's expected to rise even further as over 30 other people remain unaccounted for. It was a sobering thought from one of South Africa's most caring sons today. A Gift of the Givers founder and head, Dr. Imtiaz Suleiman, speaking on this channel earlier, said the hope of rescuing people alive continues to fade with every minute that passes. The sad reality is that it may happen again unless those entrusted with the responsibility of running this country take their roles a little more seriously. Whether it's the construction of a building or houses, providing healthcare, education, or land reform, lives and livelihoods are always at stake, which means everything is a matter of life and death. Now, in the lead up to election day, we know politicians are listening. With just over 2 weeks to go to all that important election, we are being reminded every day of the need to sober up when we take decisions and not take things for granted. That X that you'll be putting next to whoever or whichever party you choose is not something you should take lightly. Think carefully about it. Ask yourself whether the people you will choose have demonstrated to you that they care for this nation, and most importantly, they're prepared to build rather than collapse this nation. Remember that on your road to vote. And that's it from us today. Do join us again next week, same time.